and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation with journalist, photographer, and former labor organizer David Bacon. David Bacon has also been broadcasting over the years at my home station of KPFA for many decades now. He is the author also of a number of books. His latest, what we're going to be in conversation about, is a book of photography, pictures that were taken in a span of 3 decades at the U.S.-Mexican border, and also of migrant communities both within the United States and within Mexico. The book is called More Than a Wall. David Bacon, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Mitch.
I really appreciated your book. It's a beautiful book. It's also a book of much depth and stories in there. And part of what I thought added to the depth was the fact that these photographs do span a period of 30 years. Was that important to you? What did it say to you to have 3 decades worth of photographs in this book?
Well, what it allowed me to do was to present the border region in a deeper way than would have been possible if I had just gone down there a couple of times over the course of the year and then taken those photographs and tried to present that as being an image of the border. Because what it means is that 30 years of photographs, and also there's some oral histories in there as well too, they allow me to show a little bit of the history of what's happened at the border. And that's important because the idea of the book, and the reason why it's called More Than a Wall, is to be able to look behind the stereotypes that we have, especially in this country, but in Mexico too, of the border as being just simply this wall that separates our 2 countries, to see that it's actually a region that, especially now, is filled with people, millions of people. You know, Tijuana is a city of 2 million people, so is Juarez. And this is historical as well too, because if you go back 50 years, these were much smaller places. So the border has changed. And part of what has changed also on the border is the growth and development of popular struggles around housing, around organizing unions and factories there, people on this side of the border trying to deal with the environmental contamination that is also a product of history. So the photographs allow us to sort of see the span of time as well as the space that is represented by, the border and then the region on either side of it.
Do you see changes over this period of time at the border that also correspond with changes of political sentiment concerning immigration in the border here?
Well, yes, both good and bad. In the book, the book sort of tells the story in photographs and oral history there of a organizing drive and a strike in a maquiladora that took place about 20 years ago, a Korean-owned factory in Tijuana. And it was a very seminal, very important strike at the time. But in the end, after 3 years worth of fighting, the workers there were pretty much defeated and the factory actually closed. Just recently, we had an election. We saw an election at a factory, a General Motors assembly plant in Mexico, in Silao, where the workers were successful at organizing an independent union. In fact, just signed a contract with General Motors. So the politics of Mexico have changed a lot since then. Andrés Manuel López Obrador is a product of a social movement in Mexico that has said that people are fed up and tired of the kind of neoliberal economic reforms that have been imposed on people in Mexico over the last 30 years. In fact, I was in the Zocalo in Mexico City, the Central Plaza, when López Obrador took office and heard his speech in which he said, the last 36 years of neoliberal policies in Mexico are over, basta. And that's one reason why workers were successful at organizing this union, was because they faced a different kind of political situation in Mexico than workers had faced at the Han Young factory in Tijuana 20 years earlier. So That's something that's important to recognize. On the other hand, in terms of our discourse about the border, it's become pretty poisonous, I think, really. Remember, Trump was elected as a result of these rallies in which people would chant, build the wall, build the wall. And he made such a big deal out of the wall itself. And so part of the book, I'm interested in looking at the wall. So I want to go beyond the wall, more than a wall, but I also want to look at the wall itself. And that also has a very interesting history of kind of how it's developed. If you go back 100 years, there was no wall between the US and Mexico. In fact, the first barbed wire fences were put in during the Nixon administration. And Pat Nixon famously went to the border park at right outside of Tijuana, and made a speech to the Mexicans on the other side, and this is after the U.S. had installed this barbed wire fence, in which he said, well, I hope that someday we will not have between our two countries and that we will have friendship between our peoples. And this is Pat Nixon, the wife of Richard Nixon, a Republican president that many people on the left in this country really hated. But, contrast that with what we have now, coming from the Republican Party. And I have to say, not just the Republican Party either. And this whole idea that the wall is needed in some way to prevent any intermixing of the people on either side of it. There's some photographs, Mitchum, that I took at the Playas de Tijuana, which is the area where the border fence goes down a hill and then out into the ocean, right south of San Diego. And every Sunday, this group of activists, they sort of set it up so that divided families can come from either side of the border and meet each other. And, it takes some doing to set up, because you have to contact the family in Mexico, which might be 1,000 miles away, and the family in the U.S. too. But the families, they come together in this park on a Sunday. And the Border Patrol allows people on the U.S. side to get close to the fence, which sometimes they don't do. On the Mexican side, nobody cares. You can go up to the fence and do whatever you want. On the U.S. side, there's this much heavier kind of militarized presence. And so these photographs, they show people greeting each other through the wall, family members greeting each other through the wall. And there's a particular part of this wall that consists of kind of a mesh, a wire mesh, with holes in it that are about half an inch square. And so people will stick their fingers through the hole, and their family member on the other side will stick their finger there too, and they will touch. And this is the permitted touching that goes on that Sunday. And so, this is kind of the human, I want to say the human cost, but also what it means in human terms for people. How do families deal with being divided? What does the border wall mean to them? Again, if you went back 100 years, people would be able to walk back and forth freely and embrace each other if they lived on different sides of it. Not now. And it sort of underlines also something else I think about that the book is trying to get at, and my other books do too, and that is the separation of people, the separation of families, where part of the family now lives in the United States, part of the family lives in Mexico. What happens when a baby is born in the U.S. on the U.S. side or on the Mexican side? There's another picture in there of this one too, and that is, there's a young woman with her baby who's just been born here, and part of her family is over on the other side, and she's holding up the baby, and so the family on the U.S. side can see their new family member. It's heavy. It is very emotional too, taking these pictures.
This place in Tijuana at the border, isn't this Friendship Park?
Yes, yeah. That's the irony. It's called Friendship Park.
I've been there. It was many years ago, but if I recall correctly. Memory's tricky, Mr. Bacon. But if I recall correctly, I think I remember them playing a game of volleyball with the wall being the separator.
Yeah. Well, the wall is very long. And so all kinds of things, or the border, let's put it that way, the border is very long, and all kinds of things happen along it. And that's one of them. And this is a way that, especially immigrant rights activists on both sides of the wall, kind of make fun of the wall, and saying, oh, let's use it as the volleyball net and we'll shoot the ball back and forth, right? People use that wall in a lot of different ways. Artists use it. I used it. At one point, we had an exhibition of photographs. I got involved in this conference in Tijuana that's put on by the university that actually just published this book and the last one too. And in this conference, they wanted to have an exhibition of photos of people, Mexicans working in the U.S., that we would show on the Mexican side as a way of sort of demonstrating that so many people from Mexico, in fact, 10% of the population of Mexico lives in the United States. And so I made these big prints of farm workers, and we put them on the border wall. We had an art show on the border wall of these gigantic photographs of people. And other people do things, graffiti. The wall gets graffitied all the time. So people, spray paint slogans, or they do pictures or installation art of one kind or another. There's a picture in the book of a time where part of the wall had these wooden crosses on it, and the crosses had names of people who had died in the desert trying to cross the border. And then underneath the wooden crosses, these white painted wooden crosses, were these sort of empty gallon milk jugs that were the kinds of things that people leave out in the desert filled with water, so that migrants who are crossing the desert don't die of thirst and have some water there. So it was a sort of a way of showing the human cost of an artist or a group of artists in Mexico on the Mexican side, showing what the human cost of the wall was and putting it right there on the wall. And the wall, Trump wants us to believe that this wall is this huge impenetrable barrier. But the reality of it is that it's in the new places, the wall consists of these tall, 20-foot high iron bars right next to each other that are very kind of smooth on each side to supposedly so you can't climb over them. Of course, people put ladders against them and climb over them if there's nobody looking. Then there's an older part of the wall, which consists of these big metal plates that were used to make landing strips in the South Pacific during World War II that were then recycled into the first real border wall. And it's sort of made up of these corrugated steel plates. And there are parts of the wall that in the Colorado River, when the Colorado River gets down close to the Sea of Cortez, it dries up. There's no water in it anymore. And in the water, in the bed of the river, in the sand bed, there are these kind of metal obstacles that make it impossible to drive a vehicle through there. But if a human being, a person, you could just, climb over it and, no big deal. So there's that kind of wall. And then there are places where, the wall, especially these iron bars that they're so busy building, they just stop. And then there's nothing. And you go, why doesn't somebody just walk around it? Of course, the Borders Patrol is there to try to stop people from doing that. But it just shows you the irrationality of it, is that it's, and it's also, it's like, it's not the Great Wall of China. This is no feat of engineering here. Even the new modern wall, these iron bars, they're rusting. Another 100 years, they're going to be rusted and probably pretty, bad shape. And they're just sort of stuck in the ground, Putting them there, it didn't require, skilled construction workers. There was no plumber, there was no electrician, there was no, they're just digging a ditch, putting the bars in, covering it with cement. That's it. So it's like, it's not any great feat of U.S. engineering know-how that we put it there. It's just a wall. you know, for the people who live on the south side of it, it's also, it's as much a symbol for people in Mexico as it is for us, really.
Yeah.
People look at it and you say, what is it? What does it mean? It means you don't like us. Rejection. And here we are doing all the work in your fields and cleaning your offices on the other side of the wall, and you build this wall to tell us that we're not wanted. I mean, get off it, right? It's very, very irrational, the whole thing. And so part of the book is trying to explore that, but explore it in a way that, so that we see that as heavy duty, as simple as the wall really is, that's not all there is to life on the border. In fact, it's not even a very important part of life to the people who live on each side of it, who have to go about doing the normal human things that they do, especially, the kinds of social things that they do, organizing their social movements. And the border is there, but it's kind of a backdrop almost in some ways.
Very interesting. I did not know the story about Pat Nixon going to the border in the 70s and they putting just a small fence there and her saying, hopefully one day we'll be able to take this thing away again. What was significant about that time of 1970s, even to put it sounds like a very modest fence in?
I don't know if there was really any particular political development that required it. I think this was, obviously it was a PR op, and so maybe there were Republican politicians in California who saw this as being a campaign, a way of getting votes. That's really what the border wall is in a lot of ways. It's a way of getting votes on the U.S. side of the border. And maybe she was ashamed. Maybe she went down there, she saw what the reality of it was and said, hey, sorry. Yeah. That's kind of what it feels like, that speech.
In your introduction, you wrote about a history of using art. You use photography here as art as well, and sort of a comparison. And I was fascinated when you talked about the great Mexican muralists of the 1930s.
Right. This is a very important part of well, I would say Mexican culture in the sense that the great muralists of the 30s, Diego Rivera and David Alfaro Siqueiros and Orozco, were Mexican, and they created this form of art that it had roots. I mean, people were painting frescoes in the Middle Ages on the walls of churches. And in some ways, the fresco technique that was used by Rivera and the other muralists has its roots there. But they developed this very popular style of it that came out of the Mexican Revolution. And the politics of the murals, which were very political, came out of the revolutionary politics of Mexico. But very, very quickly, that art form crossed the border. If you drive around San Francisco, you can see murals everywhere. And especially since the 60s and the growth of the Chicano movement in the US and the growth of popular movements, which also see muralism as being a very important and effective way of communicating, that, we've had this explosion of murals here. But the Mexican muralists came to the United States and painted murals here. In fact, Rivera famously painted a mural for the Rockefellers in New York City. And when they took a look at the fact that he included portraits of Marx and Lenin, painted the mural over. And so he had to repaint it on these movable panels, which, are still, I don't remember exactly where they are now, but they tried to reproduce it anyway. But they also trained artists here, and who then went on to create a whole school of popular art here in the US that was in part a product of Mexican muralism, but also adapting, US art styles to the political issues of the day. The Coit Tower murals and the Refreshie murals in the post office in San Francisco are a product of that. And so this kind of communication has been going on for quite a while, this cross-border cultural effervescence and exchange. And, and I kind of look at myself as being part of that as well, too. Photographers are definitely part of it. Mexican and US photographers have learned from each other over many years and exchanged visual ideas and our ideas about what the role of photography should be. So, and I think that it's very important to me that this book about the border was published in Mexico. It's a bilingual book, so it's meant to be read on both sides of the border. And the book before it, which was about farm workers, called In the Fields of the North, which was also a book of photographs and bilingual text or oral histories mostly, was published by the same university in Mexico and by the University of California in the US here. And it came out in 2017, which was a year after Trump was elected. And so this is kind of like our answer to Trump, as you say that we should have this wall and look at each other in this, really terrible way. And what we're going to do is we are going to create artwork that crosses the border. And so these books are sort of my little, as they say, granito de arena, my little grain of sand added to this this effort. But there are many, many artists and many people who are exploring the same idea of trying to create an internationalist culture that exists on both sides of the border.
Tell me about this conversation about the role of photography at the border.
Well, the role of photography at the border is, in the introduction to the book, I sort of get into it a bit. And so does, I had the honor of having an introduction to the book written also by Don Bartletti, who worked for the LA Times over many, many years. He was their border photographer and actually got a Pulitzer Prize for his work. And so Bartletti talks about it, and I talked to some Mexican photographers about it as well, too. And it's sort of about a reaction to what I would call parachutism. The idea that, and it's not just applicable to the border, but you see it a lot in relation to the border. And that is the idea that you can kind of go somewhere and take some pictures and leave, and then show your pictures as being a kind of a representative look at what it was that you were documenting. And, in part, this is a product, I think, of photojournalism and taking pictures for newspapers. And I have a lot of friends, and I'm a good union member of the same union that photographers who work for the Chronicle or the New York Times belong to. And so I understand what the demands are of working for a newspaper as a photographer. That you get assigned to go someplace, you take the pictures, they appear in the newspaper, and, it's an important thing that people do. However, I think that you cannot do that and take a look at as important and as complicated a phenomenon as the border between the US and Mexico and treat it that way. And so Bartletti, in his introduction, he reacts to that really strongly, because he spent, 30, 40 years on the border documenting it as a photographer for the LA Times. Of course, I did this not working for a newspaper, and I did it as a documentary photographer, sometimes having a story in mind that the photographs were going to go with, or sometimes taking the photographs because there was something important happening and I wanted to document it. And so the idea is that we need a way of using photographs that contribute to forming a richer tapestry of imagery. It's like sometimes I think of it as it's like an impressionist painting, where you have these dots of color and all together they produce an image. They produce something that's much greater than each individual piece. And so you could go kind of look through the book here, and each photograph, I hope, as a photographer, I hope each one stands on its own. But part of it is also the accumulation of the images, and that you sort of get this much broader picture because of seeing many of them together, and one's taken over a long period of time. And so I think that what Bartletti is reacting to, and what I do as well too sometimes, and that's why I had this discussion at the beginning of the book, is the idea that that our media institution has, of this kind of facile way of sending somebody. You take the pictures, put them in the newspaper, put them in the New Yorker. This is the border. I think it kind of is not a good way of going about things. I think it doesn't produce an accurate picture. And what also gets lost in it, especially because of what kind of media that we have here in the US, what gets lost in here is the social movements of people, which is what I'm especially interested in documenting, because our media has, generally speaking, mainstream media has very little interest in social movements to begin with. And so if they're going to send somebody to Tijuana or to, the Calexico to take photographs, they're not going to be interested in the efforts to organize a union in a maquiladora or there's a whole other part of the book that talks about what are called communities of resistance, which are sort of these communities that get set up by people coming from southern and central Mexico to the border, mostly to look for work in factories, but sometimes across the border. And then they have a lot of problems surviving as communities. The government comes down on them, or at least it used to, very hard. And so people resist. That's where the idea of communities of resistance comes from. And because of the kind of mixture of social movements on the Mexican side of the border, the same people who are involved in the struggle for housing, really, in the desert, in these communities, also wind up being people who will try to organize independent unions in factories or organize strikes and further down in Baja California in the strawberry and the tomato fields. So it's sort of this mixture of social movements. And that's something that it takes time to document. And you have to document at different periods when this is happening. And I think that that's what gets missing. That's what drops out of the coverage in our media, where you sort of look for the sensationalistic images of the wall or something terrible happening around the wall. It's not that terrible things don't happen, but that what you miss is the lives and this very rich culture and this very rich social history of the people who live there. And it's not just Mexicans on the Mexican side of the border. After all, the Imperial Valley was the scene of some of the biggest strikes of the United Farm Workers Union. So it's also, our side of the border has this history to it too that I think is equally important to show and document.
Taking someone's photo is a very personal and intimate thing to do. And clearly that a lot of your photos are very personal and intimate. You have photos of people who are working in the fields. You also have photos of families within their own homes. How do you approach that? It's kind of difficult. There's a bit of a social wall sometimes. I've taken up photography, but rarely do I take photos of people because A, I won't do it unless I have their permission, and then B, usually I'm just too shy. So how do you approach taking photographs? How did you get within these communities of the people that you took photographs of?
Well, that is a really important question, because this book and my work in general is not done by me, just by myself in isolation. So I go places and take photographs and talk to people in cooperation with not just other people, but organizations of people. So the photographs of farm workers on the US side of the border, for instance, are taken in cooperation with, for instance, there's an organization of indigenous migrants from Mexico that has chapters in Mexico and US called the Frente Indígena de Organizaciones Binacionales. And I've had a working relationship with the Frente for 20 years. And so in the US, I will go out with somebody from that organization and talk to people that they know working in the fields, or we'll go and visit people at home, talk to them at home. There's a chapter of the Frente Indígena in the San Quintín Valley, which is the big agricultural valley in Baja California. And in the year of the strike, I went down there, and people from that chapter would take me to places to meet people and to take their photographs and talk to them. So there's a photograph in the book of a family, as you were referring to, and it's very kind of like a family portrait. So it's a posed photograph in which the whole family got together in this cinder block house, no electricity, no running water, in a working class barrio for people who work in, the agricultural company there, this big rich company. And so I went and I met this family because of my relationship with people from the Frente. They kind of introduced me. I talked to the family on the phone first, then made arrangements to go down and visit them. And so, of course, I get there and we talk, and, I explain who I am, what the pictures are for. And, they decide what they want to do about it, which in my case, fortunately, was, help me take the pictures. So it wasn't just that picture. There's another picture in the book. It's really this beautiful picture. It's like the wall in their kitchen. And they have written on the wall all these lovely things that they say to each other that are just full of love and affection. And I just saw that on the wall. I thought, oh, this is just so beautiful. And then, of course, there are other pictures that show, of the bed of one of the family members on a dirt floor in one of the houses. So you can see how poor people are. And so trying to kind of present a way of looking at this family through these images that is complicated. Is, you're trying to show what the part of the reality is, which is poverty, but not people who are ground down by it in a way that, the idea is to feel sorry for people. I don't think feeling sorry for people does anybody any good. So, in fact, I want to get about as far away from that as I can. So, it's a reality check that includes this complex reality of how people feel about each other, how they want to present themselves in a family portrait, the bed on the floor. So that's how that picture gets taken, is because of my relationship with an organization there. And the relationship gets quite, over time, I would say quite deep. I was on the board and still am on the board of advisors for the Frente Indígena. I'm not indigenous, obviously, myself, or Mexican, but there is a board of kind of like advisors or helpers, I guess you would say, that the Frente has. I've been on there for a long time. Some of the Maquiladora pictures got taken because I got involved with the Coalition for Justice in Maquiladoras, which was an activist organization that was a sort of support network for workers who would want to organize unions in factories and strikes in factories there. And so I would go down and I would only find out about what was happening because I was involved with this organization, and people would call from a factory and say, hey, we're going to do this, or we're going to be on strike or something. And I would go down with the camera and cover it. And, and eventually I wound up on the board of the Coalition for Justice in Maquiladoras too. And it can kind of play both ways. When I went and covered the strikes of this Korean-owned factory that I was talking about, Han Young, at one point, I parked my car on the street in downtown Tijuana. I went to talk to this human rights activist in a restaurant, and I get back out to the car, and the windows were broken, the trunk had been popped, and all my cameras, my tape recorder, all my stuff had gotten stolen. So, and I asked the guy who I was talking to, it was funny, he had as his bodyguard an off-duty policeman in Tijuana. And so Mario, the off-duty cop, said, oh, yeah, well, they're just sending you a message. You come down here with your camera and you take pictures of strike, and people are going to, this is the police in Tijuana and the Maquiladora Association saying, if you come down and mess with us, here's just a little taste of what could happen to you. So, being involved as a participant, it has its, it's not just a free ride, I guess I would say. But on the other hand, I'm a labor activist, I'm a union person. and have been all my life from my family. So, I mean, I completely identify with the effort of these workers to organize their union and go on strike, and want to do everything I can to help them. And so taking pictures is part of helping them. But it also means that I have access in a way that I would not have if I was just, if somebody had told me, well, go down to Tijuana, we hear there's a strike there, go down and make some friends and see if you can get some pictures out of it. The relationship is more complex than that. And so in a way, the book is sort of a collective effort, and without those relationships, none of this really would exist. And so part of it is also payback. It's trying to use the images to help, it's a normal thing that, in my relationship with California Rural Legal Assistance or the Frente Indígena or the Coalition for Justice in the Maquiladoras, the pictures I take, I give to the organization and then they use them for whatever purposes they have. Do a newsletter or fundraiser or something, use the image. And so it's sort of like to help move it forward in that way. But it's also because, as a photographer and a writer, I sort of hope that the book itself is going to have an impact in the sense that it's going to help make people think, because the whole idea of doing this work is to change the way people think. And so if it's successful in that, it will help to give people a broader idea of what the border is about and help encourage people to become human rights activists and labor rights activists and, get active and do something and not just enjoy the pictures, but also that they will sort of inspire something to happen as a result of it.
David Bacon, you are a photographer, but you're also a broadcaster, sort of opposite ends of the media spectrum here. One entirely visual, the other entirely audio. And you could build the bridge for me in that. But just to point out, you've been with KPFA, my home station, Pacifica Station, KPFA in Berkeley, for many years. You for many years were doing labor reports for KPFA. And my understanding is you first started at KPFA when you were a teenager.
Mm-hmm. I did. I was 13 years old. No, I couldn't have been 13. I guess maybe I was 15, something like that. And I dropped out of high school, Oakland Tech, and went looking for a home, kind of, or a mental, emotional home. And I wound up going up to KPFA. In those days, they had a folk music program on Friday nights, the Midnight Special with Gert Quirino, I remember. And so I would go up there and I would hang out with everybody else in the studio and listen to folk singers. It was when the folk song music movement was really strong, and got involved there. And then that was the time when they organized the first union at KPFA. And there was a very famous broadcast journalist, Elsa Knight Thompson, who got fired. And so we all walked out on strike to get her job back. I was just a teenager at the time. So that was sort of the beginning of my involvement with KPFA. But, and so, I mean, yes, I was definitely in love with radio. I still am. I think radio is just a really incredible, wonderful medium. All you have to do is go out to the field somewhere here in California and listen. And there are all these workers with the radios attached to their belt and listening to the radio all the time. I mean, it is a very flexible and wonderful medium. But I also, at a certain point, the beginning of the 90s, got much more involved in it. And that was because at the same time that this is about the period when I stopped being a labor organizer as a job and started doing what I'm doing now. And it was a long period of transition. It took a few years. So as part of it, what I was trying to do is I was trying to write, trying to take pictures, trying to communicate, especially about the labor movement, about workers and about immigration and unions and so forth. And so at KPFA, I began producing a program that originally was called Labor and the Global Economy. It was on in the evening. And there's an image in this book here of a union election, even before the Han Young strike in Tijuana, of workers trying to organize an independent union there. This must have been 92 or so. And that, I went down to cover that election and interviewed people who were there, including U.S. unionists, Virginia Rodriguez, an old friend, and went back to KPFA and we put it on the air. And that was really exciting, and the pictures in the book here of that, of workers voting there. And it was a very interesting vote because workers had to vote out in the open. There was this table that got set up outside the factory, and these women at the table with typewriters, and they would type out statements. And as a worker would come up to the table, they had to declare out in the open whether they were going to vote for the company union or the independent union. This is in front of the company. They would have to declare this and then sign the statement that had been typed out. Obviously, this is a real way of intimidating people. And so we were documenting how intimidating this whole process was. And there were all these union members from the US. And so I was interviewing them all and put it on KPFA. And that kind of led to a whole effort to use radio to cover the same things that I was covering in print or in photographs. And they would be mutually kind of reinforcing. There were some times where I would interview somebody for this radio show, eventually got to be part of the morning show. And, I would set up these interviews and interview somebody about something. Then I would go out and cover it and take pictures or turn the interview into an article. Or they were it worked really well together. And I did that for, 18 years, I think. 18 or 19 years we had that show on KPFA.
David, you are clearly a photojournalist. Your photos are documenting moments in time, important moments in time, worth being considered news. But your photographs are also quite beautiful, and there's clearly an art form to it too. So how do you have an approach when you take photographs and thinking of it as an art form as well?
Well, I love photographs and I love photography, and I have a whole library of photography books and look at what other photographers do. And yes, it is an art form. It's the creation. In the same way as artists create paintings or pieces of music, people create photographs. It's not to say that every photograph is the product of this process of creation, because you have to take it seriously. You have to try to look at what you're photographing. And of course, once you take the image, nothing comes out of a camera the way in a finished form, let's put it that way. It has to be worked with. And so in order to create the final finished image, I guess you would say. And there's a lot to it. There's a craft to this process for being able to take the image, being able to visualize the image while you're taking it, to see how different pieces of the image work together, how you can take, like one common thing that I do as sort of photographers, I didn't invent it certainly, is to use a wide angle lens when you're taking a portrait of somebody and getting very close to them so that you see the face or the figure of the person very large in the frame. And then in other parts of the frame, you see other pieces of information, let's say something that might tell you something about the person in the frame. But they also have to balance each other dynamically. You have to feel a certain aesthetic pleasure from the way the different elements of the photograph relate to each other. And then because I love black and white, the tonal values also are part of the way that part of the pleasure that you get from seeing the image. And so you have to produce them. It's not just automatic. So, it's a learning process. I still have a darkroom. Obviously, I started taking photographs in the era of film. And so the process was involved developing the film and then printing them in a larger in a dark room. And that has certain magic to it. Photographers talk all the time. The old guys or the old people, the old women talk about the magic of seeing the image come up in the developer tray when you first see the image appear on the paper, which is true. Don't use darkroom hardly at all anymore. I still have it, but now a lot of it takes place on a screen. But the process is really the same of trying to work with the image and composing it and making it kind of work together. Also, I think that there's a lot of this process that is not completely conscious, because I know that when I'm taking photographs, if I'm out in a field, for instance, taking pictures of workers, partly it's out of necessity because I have to work pretty quickly because people are moving all the time and I have to move with them and sort of set up the photograph in my mind and in the camera and take it all while everything is going on. Sometimes talking to the worker at the same time as this is all happening. And so the formation of the image happens also on a level that I'm not completely conscious of. So, I'll sometimes see things in the image after I have it on the screen and I'm looking at it that I wasn't completely aware were there when I was taking the picture. But obviously part of my mind was, because it works, it put it in there to work. So it's a very, it can be a very complicated and creative and process. But at the end of it, you have an image that has importance on a lot of different levels. It has importance aesthetically. In other words, the image works together. And the great photographers of our time are people who can do this, who can produce these images that you look at them, and aside from the content and the beauty or the politics of them, you just appreciate them for the sheer beauty of the image. But then also that work on all these other levels as well too, that have this political context that the photographer is trying to show you, and that also have this humanistic aspect to them as well. And I think that makes photography a very complex process, because the images work on all of these different levels at the same time. And a successful image, I think, is one that is able to do all of this at the same time, and the pieces of it kind of integrate with each other.
I suspect, by looking at your book, More Than a Wall, that it's also important to you how, especially with your photos of people, how they would feel about that photo.
Yes, it is. And so to the extent as possible, I try to give people back the images. Actually, it's easier now in some ways than it used to be in the days of film and paper, because you couldn't actually see the image until you developed the negative and you printed it and so forth. And so it was certainly not accessible to somebody who was on the other side of the camera, so to speak, until all that process had gone through. And of course, life moves on. And, whether or not I was able to connect with that person again to give them the image, hopefully so, but obviously not always, right? These days with a digital camera, you can actually show somebody the image right after you take it. And sometimes that's a really great technique for making friends with people and breaking the ice. I'll go out to a field and we're taking pictures with workers and we're joking, I'll say, I'm only going to take pictures of the good looking people, and if you're ugly, forget it. And everybody's laughing and joking with each other about who's good looking and who's not and so forth. And I'm starting to take the pictures, and I can show you, hey, see here, there you are, you like it? And of course, if somebody thinks it's a really horrible, hateful image, they can go, oh no, and you erase the image from your memory card. But usually, people kind of like seeing themselves. And then, of course, how you get the image later to them depends on how much time you have. I took pictures of these guest workers, H-2A workers in a field in Oregon at one point, and I collected people's names, and I collected a couple of email addresses as well too. And so later I, got in touch with one of the workers and he said, well, where are the images? I want to see them. And so I put them up on Flickr and Flickr site and sent them the address. And all of a sudden there were 93 viewers of the Flickr site, which I think were the workers and the crew and their family members and whoever else, And that's when the process gets really wonderful, but this is the real world and it doesn't happen that way all the time. You just try and make it a way of communicating. The process of taking photographs, a way of communicating with the people who are the subjects of the photograph as well too.
David Bacon has been our guest. Again, David Bacon is a journalist, photographer, and former labor organizer, also a longtime broadcaster at my home station, KPFA, in Berkeley. He has joined us for a conversation about his book of photography. It's called More Than a Wall. David Bacon, I've enjoyed that. Thank you.
So have I, Mitch. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.